Enlightenment by Roy Potter. Introduction. A few preliminaries will make this book more approachable. For starters, terms of art, which are as inescapable as they are unsatisfactory. In John Pocock's opinion, the phrase, "the English Enlightenment," does not ring quite true. Maybe. But following his own example, I shall be using it all the same. It is admittedly an anachronistic term, but it captures, I believe, the thinking and the temper of a moment, one of whose leading lights could declare, "Our first concern as lovers of our country must be to enlighten it." I have, however, avoided the term pre-enlightenment, since that confuses rather than clarifies. I shall, however, refer to the early or the first Enlightenment, alluding roughly to pre-1750 developments, or approximately to what is mainly covered in the first 11 chapters of my book. I also write of the late or second Enlightenment, indicating in broader terms what happened after the middle of the century, or what may be found in the latter part of the book, that is, the enlightened critic of enlightenment. The long 18th century sometimes serves as a shorthand for the entire span from Restoration to Regency and other chronological markers, like Georgian and Hanoverian, used equally elastically. Over the years, Pocock and others have been urging that, to avoid making progressive voices sound too much like a causes or a conspiracy, we should drop the definite article and maybe also the capital letter, and speak not of the Enlightenment, but rather of enlightenment, or better still, enlightenments. I fully endorse this typically shrewd suggestion, which is particularly germane to Britain, where there never emerged, as some think they did in France, a little flock, a party of humanity. The British avant-garde was not a network of persecuted rebels or underground Semicide authors, destined to hand down the torch of a liberal democracy to Kennedy's America or Blair's Britain. They are better likened to the mixed clientele talking in a hot, smoky, and crowded coffee house. Men sharing broad convictions and sympathies, but differing and agreeing to differ on matters dear to their hearts. Mention of a man leads to the vexed issue of gendered language. Like those coffee house politicians, the great majority of the thinkers discussed below are male. The idiom they used, man of letters, man of mode, the common man, etc., was gendered through and through, as were their assumptions. When thinkers like John Locke spoke of a man, there doubtless lurked a generic, if a tacit notion of mankind in general. But the people they actually envisaged as doing the teaching and preaching, writing and enlightening, were male. They did not think much of women in such public contexts, and when they did, they singled them out specifically. This silently gendered language reflected a man's world as defined by dominant male elites, and to catch the tones of the times, I largely follow their practice here. One further note on terms. The Act of Union, 1707, united the parliaments of England and Scotland, creating Great Britain. Scotland thereby accepted the Act of Settlement, enacted by Westminster in 1701, which designated the Hanoverians as Queen Anne's successors. A second Act of Union of 1801 incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom. My usage of national terms in the following pages will be less technically constitutionalist. I often employ English as a shorthand for English language, and the terms English and British somewhat interchangeably when referring to ideas and developments broadly shared by elites living in the British Isles. Since practically all enlightened thinking was then actually coming out of English heads, especially during the first third of the 18th century. By contrast to this lumping habit, English and Scottish will be distinguished to when I am specifically addressing regional traditions and themes. And I shall devote much of Chapter 10 to developments characteristic of the Scottish Enlightenment. Numerous thinkers of Irish and Welsh extraction, John Toland and Richard Price, for example, also achieved eminence, but except fleetingly in chapters 10 and 20, I do not focus on controversies taking place within and about Ireland and Wales. Usage will be clarified by context. If this laxity sometimes seems confusing or is galling to modern nationalist sensibilities, it reflects the realities of a time when English was commonly applied to people born anywhere in our Isles. In this book, far too many themes receive short measure. I do not give much space to political debate, literature, and the arts, to ties of taste, the commercialization of a culture, or the forging of nationalism. Apart from space constraints, the reasons are plain. Splendid books have appeared recently in all these areas, and rather than redigging sound foundations, I have instead tried to build on the spade work of my fellow historians. Likewise, few extended exegeses of major philosophies are offered here. Once again, in many instances, fine studies already exist, and in any case, my chief concern lies with the intricacies of, say, Hobbes, Hume, Hutton, and Hazlitt than with the interplay of activists, ideas, and society. Historians of the Scottish Enlightenment may feel particularly aggrieved. Does not the Norse British contribution deserve greater attention? Don't the literati of Aberdeen, St. Andrews, and Glasgow, not to mention the Athens of Norse itself, Newtown and all, warrant chapters all to themselves? I would not scan the brilliance of the Caledonian contribution, but once again, notable studies already exist upon which I shall draw. And since my interest is more with meanings and impacts than with origins, I have perhaps cavalierly chosen to splice Scottish thinkers into the British story as a whole. I greatly regret that more is not said here about a continental influence upon Britain, and the reciprocal uptake of British thinking overseas. Insular history has no virtues, and any claims staked below about the Englishness of the English Enlightenment or about English exceptionalism must rest on firmer foundations than fog over the channel obliviousness to developments elsewhere. I can only plead that adequate discussion of such issues would have made a long book lengthier still, and that it would require research into the literati of Milan, Mainz, and Madrid far beyond my competence. Numerous other issues cry out for greater attention. The controversies which raged over mind and body, heaven and hell, the afterlife, the soul, and the other things, to name just a few. I have an excuse for some of these omissions. I plan to address such topics in my next book, which will examine the triangle of the moral, the material, and the medical in the Anglophone Enlightenment. Next, a word on where I stand. Enlightenment historiography has been destroyed by hindsight, and remains unashamedly party Paris. Progressives have long praised the philosophies for being the begetters of the rights of man, or have traced a lineage from them to the American Republic. Indeed, the distinguished American historian Henry Commager once claimed that Europe dreamed the Enlightenment and America made that dream come true. For their part, right-wing scholars, echoing Burke and the Abbey Burial, have blamed the Enlightenment for handing the terror its ideological ammunition, while Rousseau's doctrine of the general will supposedly begat totalitarian democracy, lethally sanctioning fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism. In some chapters, it has become almost the rigor to paint the Enlightenment black. After the Second World War, totalitarian became the epithet for Enlightenment, whose managerial rationality was alleged to have imposed an administered life, which inexorably reduced society to a universal concentration camp. Echoing such reading, Michael Foucault held that despite its rhetoric, the true logic of the Enlightenment was to control and dominate rather than to emancipate. Certain modern literary critical circles take a no less jaundiced view. The new 18th century, to be found in postmodernist scholarship, Terry Castle drearily observes, is not so much an age of reason, but one of paranoia, repression, and incipient madness. These days, remarked Erica Hobsbawm in 1997, in a similar vein, the Enlightenment can be dismissed as anything from superficial and intellectually naive to a conspiracy of a dead white man in periwigs to provide the intellectual foundation for Western imperialism. Voltaire likened history to a box of tricks we play on the dead, and none would gainsay that objectivity is a mirage. Yet I believe these Foucauldian and postmodernist readings are willfully lopsided, and I shall show how and why below. I find enlightened minds congenial. I savor their pithy prose, and feel more in tune with those warm, witty, collaborable men than with, say, the aggrieved Puritans who enthrall yet appall Christopher Hill or with Peter Gaze earnestly erotic Victorians. I trust, however, that this book will be read as a work of analysis rather than one of advocacy or apology. The Enlightenment is not a good thing or a bad thing to be cheered or jeered apart from anything else. Heroes and villains' judgmentalism would be absurd, because as I shall insist ad nauseam, there never was a monolithic Enlightenment project. Enlightened thinkers were broad-minded. They exposed pluralism. Their register was ironic rather than dogmatic. The Enlightenment was not a crusade, observed Mark Gaudet, but a tone of voice, a sensibility. Tolerance was central, and the protagonists could shake hands on some matters while shaking fists on others. For much of his career, Joseph Priestley, that unflagging religion political liberal, looked upon Edmund Burke as a sympathizer, though their enmity ended abruptly with the French Revolution. Then again, while Priestley took issue with the infidel Edward Gibbon's account of its rise, they shared, in large measure, criticisms of the corruptions of Christianity. Priestley even made a point of publishing his polemical exchanges with his nonconformist Dr. Richard Price, in a candid, if quaint, conviction that dissent should be seen as the spur to truth. Little was fixed. Debate came before doctrine, and the culture wars went on among the enlightened as well as against their foes. In short, we must be sensitive to chiaroscuro so as to decry the Enlightenment's contours, attending to its limits no less than its liberations, in recognition that what permitted some truth to be interrogated was that others remained self-evident. We must resist being seduced by its slogans, and neither hypostatize the Enlightenment as the manifest destiny of humanity, nor, conversely, diabolize it as a plot of dead white males. Rather, it should be seen as a cluster of overlapping and interacting elites who shared a mission to modernize. Our social vantage on enlightened ideologues must be nuanced, taken in the view from below as well as from above, from the provinces as well as the metropolis, embracing female no less than male responses. It must be capacious enough to disclose how particular preferences led some to proceed in the name of a cost-efficient rationality, while others, like John Wilkes, played the liberty trump. To some, like David Hume, for example, Enlightenment was primarily a matter of emancipation from religious bigotry within the political status quo. For others, like Dr. Richard Price, it meant a pathway to political liberty picked out by Providence. Avoiding taking sides, this book strives to make a sense of what moved progressive intellectuals by laying bare their thinking, in the light of Locke's dictum that we must understand a thinker's terms, in the sense he uses them, and not as they are appropriated by each man's particular philosophy to conceptions that never entered the mind of that author. This is a particularly important undertaking because the world they were making is the one we have inherited. That secular value system to which most of us subscribe today, which upholds the unity of mankind and the basic personal freedoms, and the worth of tolerance, knowledge, education, and opportunity. As the Enlightenment's children, we should try to fathom our parents. As ever, that is not straightforward. While in the 18th century, progressive intellectuals backed many causes now typically approved, they also exposed others, which today we find abhorrent. John Locke championed the natural freedom of mankind, yet the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, framed by him in 1669, granted freemen in the new colony absolute jurisdiction over their slaves. Bethman deplored the criminalization of homosexuality, yet proposed castrating rapists and tattooing convicts, all on the basis of the greatest happiness principle. Mary Wollstonecraft vindicated the rights of women, but after misogynized most women haters. The age of Enlightenment, Ronald Knox once noted, was also an age of fanaticism. Complexities, convolutions, and contradictions leap up from my pages. Reason with most people means their own opinion. Thus wrote the Saturnian William Hazlitt. Without succumbing wholly to that Hazlittian mullishness born of defeat, we must beware presentism and recognize that every age, especially perhaps the age of reason, rationalizes in its own way and has its own meaning codes, spoken and implicit. To utilitarians, rationality did not only spell personal freedom, it was also disciplinary, a tool in the forging of that efficient regime in which the rational would regulate the rest. The fact that Benthamism thus spelled social control is, however, no argument for abandoning Enlightenment as a historical category. It is merely a caveat against the simplistic always for the best in the best of all possible Enlightenment's readings. Nothing could be sillier than to tight-lace the died into today's conceptual corsets. The most we can hope to do is to understand them. All the hectoring in the world will not change them. Far from judging saints and sinners, this book problematizes the progressive in the battle for the mind. While cheerfully acknowledging my massive debts to fellow historians, I also draw gratefully upon the work of literary scholars. Even the best historians have rarely done justice to the remarkable insights afforded by literary investigations into Grub Street and the Republic of Letters, into authorship and readership, into genres, canons, and registers, and into fictionalizations of self and society. In what follows, I highlighted the part played by poets, critics, and novelists in debates over identity, individuality, and subjectivity, and the role of the imagination in the politics of the gendered self, in the belief that the 18th century was truly, as Johnson thought, an age of authors. Enlightened avant-garde condemned the fossilized, prized novelty, and thrived upon controversy, self-criticism, and self-celebration. Through the medium of print, public opinion was materializing in a manner uncannily prefiguring the late 20th century data revolution and those contemporary expressions of the electric information explosion. The Internet and the World Wide Web, the progress of print, was a development upon which those two mighty adversaries, Samuel Johnson and David Hume, for once found themselves of a mind. Quote, "The mass of every people must be barbarous, where there is no printing, and consequently knowledge is not generally diffused." End quote. Rude Johnson. There had been, says to Hume, quote, "a sudden and sensible change in the opinions of man within these last 50 years by the progress of learning and liberty." End quote. The print revolution and the rise of the reading public brought new cadres of knowledge mongers into being, serving as society's eyes, ears, brains, and mouthpieces. How curious that this budding British intelligentsia has been ignored. This book aims to make a modest contribution to changing that, rethinking Albion's Enlightenment and shedding light on the black hole. That's the end of our introduction.